Greetings, friends, and welcome to the second episode in this series on biblical, historical, sociological perspectives on race and racism that come out of my 25 years of teaching race and ethnic relations at Elizabethtown College, my work as a pastor, my research, particularly among groups of color, racial ethnic groups in the broader Anabaptist community, and my global research as well. This episode is the second episode in this series, and it's entitled "Why Gentile Lives Matter to Paul and Black Lives Should Matter to Us Today." Jesus tells the story of a debtor who owed a king a large debt. The king demanded that the debtor's wife and children be sold to cover the debt, but the debtor begged for mercy. The king took pity on him, forgave his debt. But the freed debtor found a man who owed him a much smaller amount of money and demanded that the man own up and give him the money back. When he couldn't pay up, the former debtor put a chokehold on him. But when the king learned of this, he arrested the debtor that he had forgiven, torturing him until he could repay what was forgiven. Jesus' words at the end of the story are haunting and should haunt us today, I think, as we think about how we as a church and how we as Christians respond to the issues of racism, the issues of inequality, inequity in our world. This is how my Heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. That is, unless we are merciful, unless we show mercy, extend mercy. We who've received the greatest gifts, the greatest privileges, must pass those gifts on to others. We who are freed must free others. The Atlantic slave trade and the plantation slavery economy was largely supported by churches in the United States and England up until the mid-19th century. The dehumanization of Black Africans that I've talked about already was accepted by white folks as just natural. It became accepted as natural. It wasn't natural initially, but after Jefferson and others defined it as natural, it became ingrained into the early founding of this United States and into our social institutions, as I've mentioned. And this becomes what we call an ideology, a set of ideas that become part of our culture. And we don't easily get rid of ideas that become part of the culture. The idea of freedom is part of our culture and is deeply embedded within us. And so this idea that one group is superior to another group is also deeply embedded in us as a nation. And this ideology of superiority of white folks over Black becomes the justification then that is used for keeping Black folks enslaved, for beating them, for raping them, for assaulting them, for tearing apart their families, and for selling and buying them like livestock. And if white folks had just been honest and said, we need you Black folks for our economy, then when the emancipation occurred, the freed slaves could have gotten on with Reconstruction in a way that was successful, which came to a brutal end. But because there was this ideology of inferiority, they weren't able to get traction after emancipation either, because the idea that they were inferior was embedded already in American culture. And so even though they were freed on paper, they were still enslaved in the eyes of those who were in power and the eyes of those who were white. And so this dehumanization, or what we sometimes call the objectivation, because people are made objects, of Black Africans was accepted as natural. And it keeps them, again, it's used as a justification for enslaving them, for beating them, and so on. But by the mid-19th century, interestingly, some evangelical Christian voices in Great Britain and in the United States began to hear God's Spirit convicting them and revealing to them that the deep sin of slavery and oppression of others based on skin color needed to be addressed. And they were no longer willing to take for granted the reality of white supremacy, that being white meant one was better than those who were dark skinned. William Wilberforce in England becomes one of these followers of Jesus who takes racism and oppression of Black slaves seriously. He's a politician in Parliament, And he begins to agitate for the abolition of the slave trade, saying things like this, and these are quotes that he notes at the time: "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. If to be feelingly alive to the sufferings of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic, I am one of the most incurable fanatics ever permitted to be at large." So enormous, so dreadful did that trade's wickedness appear that my own mind was completely made up for abolition. Let the consequences be what they would, I was from this time determined that I would never rest until I had effected its abolition. Wilberforce comes to the oppression of black folks with an energy and a power that is based upon his conviction and the reality that the Holy Spirit is calling for the dismantling of slavery in many of the ways that those of us today are calling for the dismantling of racism. Because again, although slavery disappeared, the ideology that supported it remains in place. It remains embedded in our culture. And so when we talk about white supremacy, we're not using some political term. We're talking about exactly what Wilberforce identified, is that whites were the oppressors in this case and were oppressing those who were black. And Wilberforce becomes a major force in England. He appeals to Thomas Jefferson in this country to abolish the slave trade in the United States. But Jefferson refused to. He had already cashed in his chips with those who would define black folks as inferior. And in fact, Jefferson, interestingly, raises the question. He looks at Native Americans or American Indians and he says, their skin color is closer to ours. I think they actually have the same intelligence as we white folks from Europe, but what they need is culture and education. But black folks, he said, I don't really think they can achieve the superior qualities of white folks, but he said, we'll let science decide that. And so Jefferson creates a kind of scientific hypothesis that race scientists and eugenic scientists will later pick up on. And they do so. And they repeatedly find that white folks are superior in all kinds of ways by the measurements they used to black folks. And in fact, Jefferson's hypothesis would become the seed that would lead to race science and the eugenics movement, a movement that was meant to sanitize this country and our society of those who were inferior based on their race and their origins, their national origins, and who were, in the eyes of the movement, ruining the bloodline of a Caucasian superiority. Sterilization was used, other methods were used to prevent the wreckage of a hybrid race from developing or continuing. And of course, this becomes the same justification that is used for abortion in our own country, but is also used by Hitler to validate the mass extermination of Jews, those with disabilities, those who were gay and lesbian, any group that he deemed inferior to the so-called Aryan race that he identifies. And so what begins in this country, which we often think of, I think, somewhat innocently, becomes a huge, frankly, demonic force, both in this country, but also in Germany. And I think that's, when I talk to some of my African-American brothers and sisters, that's why they talk about this as spiritual warfare, in which prayer is desperately needed to come against the principalities and powers that were embedded within what it meant to be the United States of America. And Wilberforce's efforts would win enough support to stop the slave trade in Europe, in England, but he could not convince Jefferson. And it would be some time before the church in North America would have enough courage to do what Wilberforce did. But the Holy Spirit was moving and continues to move, and gave courage to a number of individuals, including Jonathan Blanchard and his brother. Jonathan Blanchard taught at Andover Theological Seminary. Then he left the seminary um, and was assigned a preaching assignment in southern Pennsylvania. In 1837, he finds himself a victim of stoning in my state's capital of Harrisburg by folks who were agitated with his teaching against slavery, his anti-abolition teaching, his anti-slavery teaching. And so after a somewhat indirect journey, Blanchard would find himself as the founder of Wheaton College, an evangelical school today, and a college that he built based on his ideals of social and racial justice. That this ideal, this value on the abolition of slavery and radical social reform. He permitted African American students, we're talking the mid-19th century, he permitted African American students to attend the college and to allow them to live in his own home. I come from a Mennonite tradition that up until into the 20th century was not doing such things. And so when we think about why it has been so difficult to remove and extricate racism from our own churches and from my own tradition, all we have to do is look back and see how long and just how recently we've actually abandoned, how long we held on to and how recently we abandoned segregation within our own congregations, including church plants from the mid-20th century. But Wilberforce and Blanchard had tremendous courage because for them as followers of Jesus, social justice was not a political issue. It was a biblical issue. Racial equality was not a political issue. It was a biblical issue. It was understood that as a follower of Jesus, they would take the teachings of Jesus seriously. And so Wilberforce and Blanchard lived at a time when at least some evangelical Christians understood that to be a follower of Jesus meant addressing the social ills of the day. And social justice was not considered a bad word by evangelicals of the day, at least some of them, who cared for and advocated for the poor and the oppressed and those whom white folks had defined to be less than human, and allowing for their enslavement as a result. The problem was and remains that once an ideology like racism, and I've given some background now to how this happened, is woven into the fabric of a society, it doesn't disappear with legislation. You can't legislate out of a society racism because it's not just an attitude, it's embedded into the social institutions of a society. And so when we talk about racism, we're not primarily even talking about individual attitudes. That can be part of it, but often they are a product of something that's more macro level, and why we talk about racism as systemic, that it's built into our structures, it's built into our social systems. And again, this was made abundantly clear in the failure of Reconstruction and the institution of Jim Crow, separate but equal, but certainly not equal, policies that again created segregation, a new form of slavery and oppression and bondage. And then by extension, drug and criminal justice laws would eventually create a system of mass incarceration that is really an extension of Jim Crow, an extension of slavery. The disproportionate arrest and imprisonment of particularly black men in this country is an extension of this system of racism, which has been used and built into the fabric of our society. Because again, once it's built in culturally, it doesn't easily disappear, which is why we can't stop talking about the implications of racism. You know, one of the things that I hear often is from white folks is if we just stop talking about racism, it would go away. The consequences of racism aren't going away until we have this conversation, and until changes come out of this conversation. I know there's a lot of resistance among some to what's called critical race theory, but critical race theory is nothing more than saying that power is used to subjugate groups of people, and that we have to address the power and the system that subjugates people. And until we do that, we won't ever get rid of this this evil of racism. As long as we treat it as just a kind of relational thing, I don't have a problem with black people. I have black friends. As long as we treat it as an individual relational thing, it will never go away from the culture that we're in. And so even though attitudes on survey data, at least up until recently, showed changes in white folks' attitudes towards black folks, systemic racism still exists. There have been changes. We've had an African American president, but having an African American president has not meant that the implications of racism have gone away. And so you can look at the disproportionate deaths and illnesses in COVID among African Americans and people of color to say again and to show again that these systemic differences have real life implications. So while the life expectancy overall for Americans has dropped because of COVID, it's dropped even further for Black Americans who were already lower than white Americans, substantially lower. And so in terms of money, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of health, there are real consequences. Again, sociologists like to say that situations defined as real are real in their consequences. And so racism has had real consequences for Black Americans. It's not easy for the church today to see our ongoing complicity in racial oppression. We like to say, as evangelicals, we like to treat, again, racism and oppression at kind of a personal level, because we tend to treat sin as a personal thing. I stand before God, I ask forgiveness of my sins, but we tend not to see how sin is built into the structures of our social institutions. And when I talk about social institutions, I'm talking about family and education and economy and government and politics and the media and so on. And so we tend to say, well, I'm not responsible for that. I'm just responsible for my own life. And when we do that, we back away from these social sins, as it were, that Wilberforce and Blanchard were adamantly treating as evil and demonic realities in their day and age. And so it's not easy for the church to see its complicity. The responses I've been receiving recently over the last year to my preaching, my teaching, my podcasting on racism, and my clearly stated support for racial equality and the eradication of the sin of racism, my identification of racism as sin, make it clear that it's hard for the church to address this. And I'll talk more about that in future episodes. But for some reason, those of us who are white feel terribly threatened by a Christian perspective that addresses the sin of racism and calls for the dismantling of racism, which is really an artificially, socially constructed difference between groups of people. It's not real. It's not biblically real. It's not biologically real. And yet we've created it. And what we create always has real consequences. And so the job of us, for we who are Christians and followers of Jesus, is not to debate whether racism exists, but to do the hard work of excavating our world and our society so that the consequences of racism and the inequalities that have resulted are addressed. Of all people, we who are followers of Jesus and the church should be most concerned about our brothers and sisters of color who have faced these incredible consequences, devastating, tragic consequences of racism over the last 300 years. The fact that up until this century, up into the 20th century, lynchings continued to occur into the 1940s, where people would go to church and Sunday school and then go watch somebody be lynched and take a picnic basket along with them and have a picnic while a black individual, a black usually man or black male youth, was being lynched is beyond comprehension. And that tells us, even today, how once we dehumanize people, once we say they are less than fully made in God's image, less than we are, then we can do whatever we want to them and sleep well at night because we've objectified them. God does not objectify people. If God sees every sparrow that falls and knows the hair on everyone's head, he is aware of every lynching. He is aware of every moment when excessive police force is used on an African American or person of color, and he cares deeply about that. And we as a church are called to care deeply about that as well. If we're honest, it was also difficult for the early Jewish church to come to grips with the equality that Paul was calling for in Jew and Gentile, and that will be part of our third episode. Thank you for joining me for the second episode, in which we begin to talk about this. If Gentile lives matter, Black lives should also. We'll come back to that in a third episode. Thank you, friends.